Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and video show which brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe so you won't miss a new episode. Hey, I'm your host, Frits Bussemaker, and today I'm delighted and privileged to have a conversation with Tom Wheeler. Tom, welcome to the program.
Hey, Fritz, good to see you. How are you?
Hey, Tom, I'm going to introduce you to our audience, to our listeners. You are the Executive Director of Treesistance, founder of Sinchi, a nonprofit that upholds the UN's Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. And before that, you were a founder of a number of other initiatives before you moved into, this space, sales in M&A, Chamber of Commerce. And you also volunteer at an orphanage in Cusco in the heart of the Andes. So quite a variety. You are from the UK. So my very first question is, and that before I move into what Sinchi is all about, how did you discover you want to focus on supporting the indigenous people in this world? What's driving you there? How did that result?
Well, in truth, a lot of personal experiences, I think. You obviously did your research because you found out I did this volunteer work in Peru. This was kind of a year out, and it was the year I set up my legal network.
Okay.
I don't think you really mentioned, but it's actually turned out to become the largest in the world in the last 15 years. But just before it got set up, I went to spend a year in Peru, and I guess it kind of woke me in some kind of ways. Being brought up in England in a relatively traditional kind of English household. And, some of what they say about the English about not showing our emotions is probably true. And going to South America where everything was so alive and everyone was so friendly and the emotion and the feeling involved in everything. And in this time, if you know anything about Peru, Cusco is actually in the middle of the Andes where the indigenous people are Quechuan. And I ended up spending a lot of time with different Quechuan people, Quechuan communities, and then making friends and traveling into the jungle and meeting various communities. And I mean, it had such a profound effect on my life. I mean, first on a very much an individual level, and it really helped me unlearn, I think, a lot of what Western society had taught me about connection, about community, about relationship to nature. So I was first incredibly grateful, full of gratitude for these experiences. I mean, it transformed my life in so many ways we couldn't get through if we were here for hours. And I always said when my business efforts were successful enough, then I would try and give back and in a sense of gratitude, I suppose.
Okay. Well, it does sound like you were able from a position of luxury to gain that experience because you spent a year in Peru and Cusco. Was that a wrong assumption?
Well, I wouldn't say luxury, but I mean, I was volunteering in an orphanage, cold water, but I'd been successful the years before in sales. So, I'm in a more privileged position than many people that I was able to make that decision and take that year out. But I mean, this was when I was probably 24, 25 years old.
Okay, so that's actually, are you saying that's a period in your life where you have to do that? Because otherwise you're going to be bogged down to having a job, family, kids, mortgage, whatever?
I don't know. I often joke that I had a very early midlife crisis, a very early one. I think people call it a quarter life crisis now. I think it exists. But, I went straight into kind of the corporate world and I spent 5 years from sort of 17 to 22 where by the age of 22, I was a director of a very well-known corporate publication. I was a very successful salesperson, but I was deeply miserable, I felt it was such a hole. I had a lack of purpose. I had all of the money and success had no meaning or reason to it. So it was almost a form of escapism for my own sanity. And as I said, thanks to those experiences, without it sounding too cliched, I kind of found myself and found a reason for being. And that's driven me ever since.
It's actually interesting to see that when I went to university and more or less the same way you experienced it, after you went to school, you finish your education, you immediately go off to work. And it's only then at a certain point you realize, hey, maybe I'm not doing what I want to do, what I should be doing. it's actually funny to see that the current generation is much more aware. You see much more people taking gap years, taking time off before they move on to the next phase. So it's interesting to see that we are understanding we need to do that as people to get to try to figure out where we are.
Yeah, I think I said it earlier. I don't know if it really came across, but you have to learn a lot of things,
Yeah.
I think.
Yes. Yeah.
Because we're told as we grow up that certain things are what happiness, these are the things you're supposed to do. And who says that's the right path, right? Like we all need money. That's the reality of the world we live in, to be comfortable, to have our needs met, to to just be able to do the things we love. But we have to find things which give us purpose, and that's not generally related to money. There has to be a purpose in what you do, and without it, I think that leads also to a lot of the mental health problems we see in the world and some of the issues we see.
Yeah. Okay. Now, the fact that you realize I want to do something else, which led to setting up Sinchi, helping indigenous people. To what extent is that a coincidence by just being in that location? Otherwise, if you had been in a different part of the world, would have resulted into supporting something different? Or do you feel, hey, it would have led to supporting local indigenous people?
No, I think I said it had a very profound effect on me, and it depends on how much detail we want to go into, but there's a lot of very fascinating things we can talk about with Indigenous culture, Indigenous wisdom, heritage. And it just opened my eyes to a completely different perspective. I mean, when we talk about the narrative, which we see within the West, it's very one-dimensional in some senses. And there's completely different worldviews. And this was something which was opened up to me at that point. That's where my journey started, but it led me to actually walking across Greenland solo in the south, where I actually spent time with Inuk families and learned about their communities and their culture. I spent lots of time in the outback of Australia, in northeast Arnhem Land with the Yolngu people, as well as some of the most remote islands like Tiwi Islands, and going through the central desert. So, I always had a thirst for travel and meeting different cultures, but it sent me on a kind of a journey of discovery. And, every Indigenous culture is very different. I think it's very important to say this. It's not like one collective. We can't talk about it generally, but there are similarities. And as I said earlier, I think this relationship to nature. And what I really love is this idea that we have responsibilities, not rights. I think there's very much in this part of the world, it's like, these are our rights. This is my property. Where in many Indigenous, or I'd say the majority of Indigenous cultures, it's about, this is my responsibility to the land, to nature, to my community. And I just think that's a beautiful perspective and way of thinking.
Yeah, I recognize the entitlement when you live in this part of the world where sometimes you see people around you and look, no, come on, look beyond your current environment. And that's actually what you've done. Although these are quite adventurous, you could say, endeavors you've taken, crossing Greenland, Arnhem Land. How do you plan for something like that? Is that something you meticulously plan, or is it a spur of the moment thing? I want to do this. How do you organize something like that?
Well, each one is slightly different. My time in Australia, we were very fortunate to have some great partners. A very good friend of mine is a very well-known Aboriginal photographer. So I traveled with him, Wayne William, who people should check out his work. He's incredible at what he does. Other trips have been more ad hoc. Greenland was probably the most stupid one, to be honest. I just turned up with my tent and went off into the ice caps. And I remember the guy who picked me up with the boat from the airport, and he said, "Where's your shotgun?" I was like, huh? Yeah. And it turned out that they'd had a record number of polar bear sightings that year in that part. So it wasn't the best start. And there's me with my little tent just disappearing into the ice cap. But no, every trip is different. I'm a little bit more sensible these days with a child and a family. But I think, yes, you should plan it well. But there also has to be a lot of respect for where you're going. You shouldn't be going as a tourist. There's one thing being curious, but it's about having respect for the customs, that this is in a lot of cases, indigenous land, sacred land. So you have to be very respectful of where you can go, where you can't, how to communicate. It's as important as actually planning the more practical things.
Okay. Now, so far we've explored how you got your interest into indigenous people, which led to Sinchi. But what does Sinchi do? How do you help?
Well, Sinchi has done a lot of different things. At its core, you mentioned earlier that it's about upholding the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights, which is a very important legal instrument. But of course, the work we do exists in many forms. This is led from projects in Australia, Indonesia, Botswana, Benin, Mexico, North Norway with the Sami people, North America, South America, really, I think every continent bar Antarctica. And these projects have ran from underground initiatives, academic projects, to creating a journalism guild, to documentary projects, to providing grants to Indigenous storytellers or communities. So it's existed in many ways. We also run a annual Indigenous Artist Awards to elevate Indigenous artists and storytelling. We've hosted events, festivals, film screenings, debates in Europe to raise awareness. But at the moment, our core focus is on the Amazon, and it has been for around 3 years. Maybe 4 years now. Around 4 years ago, I met this Indigenous lawyer called Vandria Barari, who is the first Indigenous lawyer to come out of Western Para. And she was in The Hague in the Netherlands and speaking at a major conference, and we made an immediate connection. And that led to her introducing me to the Indigenous Council of an area called the Tapios na Arapians, which is in Para. It's an area roughly the size of France in total, the Tapios, so a huge area. And over the last 4 years, we've been working together on a whole variety of projects to do with protecting Indigenous territories, biodiversity, land, and these range from legal instruments to renewable energy, to digital equity, to even looking at sustainable economic development.
Well, impressive. We'll make certain to put in the link to Sinchi when we release the video. Now, I also want to now make a link to one of your other endeavors, and I love the name, by the way, Treesistance. Are these related initiatives, or are they separate? And what is Treesistance about? Maybe let's begin with that.
Yeah, well, like everything in life, everything's interconnected, right? So yes, no, they are very much related. One of your previous guests, in fact, Professor Tim Buchhout van Solingen, who's the world leading authority on forest crime, had been running an organization called Forest Forces for many years, doing incredible work and featured in the UN, really is the best practice approach to protecting primary rainforest. And we decided to merge last year. So at the end of last year, we brought our organizations together, so Forest Forces and Sinchi. And Sinchi carries on its work, but we decided, because of our joint focus on the Amazon, to launch this new platform, the Treesistance, which will launch on June the 22nd. And we're very, very excited about. I think it's a completely new way of looking at environmental preservation, both on the ground, but also publicly or community-based here. So yeah, there's lots going on over the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, and because I want to, you could say, share a quote which I found on the website, which I found amazing, something I did not realize. But there is an estimated 370 million indigenous people in the world living across 90 countries. They make less than 5% of the world's population, but protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. I think there you have it in a nutshell, how biodiversity, protecting that, and indigenous people, how they're connected. It makes sense when you think about it, but it's not always that obvious.
Yeah, this is part of what we need the world to know. It's unbelievable that 80% of the world's biodiversity is protected by these communities dotted around the world. So when we're talking about the climate crisis, when we're talking about environmental damage, the fact that indigenous people, until very recently, have not been part of the conversation is quite incredible, really. And to give a figure to back that up, of the many hundreds of billions which have been spent on environmental preservation over the last decade, less than 0.15% has actually directly reached indigenous people. So it really asks you a question, doesn't it? Are we trying to save the environment, or are we trying to save it in an economy?
Good point. Now, suppose you would increase that number. What would they be able to do with that? Why would that make a difference?
Well, at the moment, many of the communities are really in a state of survival, or in a cycle of poverty. Just to give some examples, just fuel alone, basic logistics. It's hard for people to comprehend, especially in the Amazon, how big the distances are. And as you go further into the interior, the prices get more and more expensive. This leads to both labor exploitation and even sexual exploitation. And any spare money which they do have goes on literally just being able to travel. So when you have communities in a state of poverty, and if they're not, let's say, very connected to culture, and farmers or lobbyists come in offering suitcases of money or whatever it may be, of course, you're not really creating an environment where they can effectively defend the territory. So we first have to support on this front. Secondly, and I think I don't want to talk bad about any organization, but I think there's a lot of mistrust with how much money goes to big organizations and how much actually reaches those on the ground. So there's a lot of money which is lost in middle management and things like this. And I think we need to really tackle this by actually giving transparency and showing where the funds go and how they're used. Because believe it or not, the solutions can be very cost effective. It's not even millions which is needed. It's just about getting the right funding. They're not asking for huge handouts. This is just basic funding to secure land rights or to patrol territories with very simple technology can make a huge difference.
Great. Hey, so how would you then define success? How do you measure results? How do you measure impact?
Well, I think a great example is the project which Tim has been running over many years, and this is a Forest Guardian program. So to sort of lay this out a little, a Forest Guardian program has a number of stages, or let's say strategic pillars. The first is there has to be demarcation, which means you have to map the land. You actually have to prove that this land is an indigenous territory or an area which should be protected. So that's a kind of a bureaucratic process you go through. That's great, but of course that doesn't stop any of the illegal activity. People, and we can talk about the extractive industries, but they still go on, continue cutting down the rainforest, killing the biodiversity, destroying the ecosystem, which affects us all. So what we created was a model of forest guardians who actually use GPS technology to patrol their territory and document and record any illegal activity. And as one of our partners, Kasiki Dada, said, we used to use bow and arrows as our weapon, and today we use cameras. And this is vital. So they're trained on de-escalation, it's training on safe confrontation, but they patrol their territory to basically remove anyone who's there illegally. Of course, this can be very dangerous, so it has to be done with the utmost security. And this is why the third pillar is so important, and that is relationship with the justice system. So we have to facilitate relationships with the Indigenous chiefs, directly with the Public Prosecutor's Office, directly with the Federal Police. And as a result of this model, which has been created, the Maro territory, which is 420 square kilometers, they removed over 8 illegal logging concessions a few years ago. And today, it's one of the only areas in the Amazon which is pretty much illegal activity free. And this was reported in the last UN report on the UN report on forest and fauna as the best practice approach. And now what we're doing is basically expanding this model. So we're scaling this model. By the end of this year, we'll have 9 forest guardian groups protecting over 1,500 square kilometers. By 25, this will be over 5,000 square kilometers. And our vision and the model which we're rolling out will take this not just across the Amazon, but across the Congo Basin, across Indonesia, India, Papua New Guinea, and all of the world's remaining tropical forests. And why not beyond that as well? You know, this is just the start. We need a revolution of how we go about preventing deforestation. And I think the secret of this is protection through prevention. Everyone talks after the fact and they tell you what's going wrong, but we actually have to stop the destruction. We can't keep talking about after it's happened. And that's where we come in. And that's what the Indigenous people on the front lines are willing to do on behalf of us all.
That's Very impressive. And it's a big, hairy, audacious goal, but at the same time, I also think, yeah, something we must pick up. So fully on board on that. Now, I was wondering, in the way you describe it, to what extent was this a bumpy road? Have there been mistakes or dead end streets you pursue and realize, oh, this is not the way to do this?
Of course.
Yes.
Well, that's,
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's a no-brainer, but I was just wondering
yeah.
if you could share a couple of examples so people will
Yeah.
learn,
Well,
hey, this is what something to avoid.
I often say this, in the business world, for all the successes, 9 things out of 10 fail. It's the one which goes big, which everyone remembers, right?
Yeah.
And that's been definitely true of my own career. But going into the NGO space, it's been very much the same. But yeah, so a good example, I think, from the early days is we did a lot of projects where we would go in and look at documentation and storytelling, and we provide equipment, and there'd be a huge amount of excitement within the community. And they would start off incredibly well. But we didn't really always think about the long-term planning so well, and the conditions and where things would be stored and who would manage these projects moving forward. And you can imagine that the longevity and the long-term success wasn't really achieved. So I think you learn very quickly that everything needs to be considered kind of in a multiple time scales.
Yes.
I guess very much like business as well, but it's heightened the distances, the difficulty in communication over such large distances and remote areas. So that's certainly been the case. And I think really just timelines as well. The concept of time is very different, I find, when you're, let's say, in the Western world, or when you're on with generally indigenous communities or more remote places. Time exists in a completely different vacuum. So deadlines and giving specific dates and trying to push too fast, too quickly will not work. There's a natural flow of time which goes in the jungle, which you have to respect. You can't force anything. When things are meant to be, they flow in that way. When they're not, the river will go the other way.
Okay, so you will be tested on your patience. Basically, if you're a Westerner, go with the flow. That's basically that's a good lesson. I think that actually applies in any environment you're in. Is you have to be aware what are the natural cycles of an organization or a system, how quick or how slow things move, and you have to adapt to that because you can't change that.
That's it. Yeah, no, you just have to go with it sometimes, and otherwise it will send you mad.
I can imagine that. Yes. So, Tom, last couple of questions. By the way, do you see this as your life mission, or is this a project along the road of your own career? Where do you see this ending?
Yeah, I've never really thought about it in those terms. I do it because I love it. I obviously the big mission is about protecting the environment now. It started off more as as a project of gratitude, of supporting the communities which had helped me, but it's turned into something very different. Now, I think as we spoke about the 80% biodiversity, it proves that if we're serious about trying to protect the environment, this is where we have to put our energy and our time. And I see Treesistance or Sinchi as a platform which is about being an ally to Indigenous people and help raise awareness of this and directing the funds to those who need it. Where that leads, I don't know. Obviously, you've heard the plans. We have very big ideas and big concepts. We haven't even touched on half of it today. But ultimately, I do it because I love it, and I will continue to do so.
Well, we have some time. Can you share with us what are the big plans ahead of us, so we can share this with people out there?
Sure. So our official launch is going to be 22nd of June, which is World Rainforest Day. So it will be a physical event in Amsterdam, but also live streamed across the world as an official part of the program. So please tune in. We have a series of 5 events going over June. We'll also be talking in Glastonbury, one of the main stages.
Nice.
Okay. This will be with Kasiki Dada, one of our main partners and the leader of our Forest Guardian program. So that's very exciting to start. I think what's particularly interesting, though, is, or what I can't wait to do, is actually show the launch of our website and our communications. This will be quite unlike anything you've seen from the NGO space. We're working with some of the top agencies in the world, brands, all on a collaborative basis. So the communication style, the messaging is going to be completely different. So
yeah, because that's we're a couple of minutes. I want to explore that a little bit more. Traditionally, NGOs are quite on its own. It's only NGOs talk with NGOs. Now we do see ESG becoming more important with general organizations. So how do you start to bring your organization into the bigger system? So it's not just an isolated initiative where you continuously have to show and remind people it's there, but how do you bring that into, let's say, the daily routine of people and business in general?
yeah, but I think the idea for us is we're trying to move away from this idea of charity. I think a lot of people have lost trust in charity for various reasons about how much impact it makes to anxiety.
Also, what you mentioned about costs being
yeah, and we believe that it's the power of collaboration which is going to make a difference. And for that reason, we have a very creative strategy of working with brands, with media platforms, anyone who shares this same passion for instigating change. To give an example of this, you may have heard of Cake electric motorbikes. They're incredible brands. They're actually developing the world's first zero-emission motorbike at the moment. And they're one of our brand partners. They've actually donated, and they are continuing to donate electric bikes for our forest guardians, which, of course, not only takes away the cost of using traditional fuel and is better for the environment, but even more importantly, it's silent. So for security and being able to patrol effectively, it's an incredibly beneficial new tool. But with their communication, with their global community, it's not just about the bikes, it's about being collaborative partners in this storytelling and educational communication. Another example is we're working as partners with the Puberty Media Group, which is the largest media channel in the world for Gen Z and millennials, because we believe this is, of course, the future, the younger generations. So it needs a different type of communication. So they have a combined following of over 100 million, and they're our founding media partner who will be making a documentary with us later this year to their audience. They will also be feeding content and educational content through their global audience on a weekly basis. So we're taking a different approach. But what can I say? You're going to see and hear a lot more from us in the very near future.
Okay, those are great examples of very serious collaboration. So well done there. Hey, last advice, Tom, if I may. What would your advice be to those young people out there and say, hey, I want to be involved. I want to demonstrate agency. Is there something they can do?
You mean with my organization or just generally from their own?
Both, maybe.
Well, from our perspective or from our organization, we're always looking for people who are passionate and want to support and make a difference. And there's many, many opportunities they can do so. One sort of more general piece of advice, though, and I think it's important to remind everybody, because I hear this a lot, is you first do have to concentrate on making sure you are comfortable first.
Yeah.
I mean, I love the fact that there's so much passion and good intentions to make a difference. And I think it comes from a Buddhist saying, doesn't it? You first have to change yourself if you're going to change the world or something of those effects. But I think I mean this more in even a financial position, is you have to at least have your house in order first, because it takes a lot of effort, time and investment, and you have to make sure that your own needs are met first if you are going to be sustainable or make an impact. And I think, especially young people I speak to, they are so focused on working for a company which is doing good and making that they're having input from 18 years old or 20 years old. That's not always possible, but you can also do things on the side and have a bigger vision later on. So not everyone has the privilege to be able to dedicate all their time to NGO work. So you have to find a balance.
Fair point. Hey, Tom, the balance for now is, unfortunately, we're end of time. I love talking to you about what you're doing, Treesistance, Sinchi. I want to wish you lots of success. Have a great launch. and we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.